you have to allow him to share. Right?
Yes, yes.
Of course. Of course.
Let's see if it works now. It says the host isn't allowing sharing for this meeting.
Oh,
But yeah, I don't
so we are
see
just
any
it's a
option.
new system for us.
Oh, actually, I am not the host.
Who is the host?
Okay, good. Here we go.
As a manager with full screen now?
So can you see my screen?
Yes, I mean, can we make it full screen? Is it possible?
I'm sorry?
Full screen. Oh, this is full screen. No, you have gone to somewhere else. You have to go back to. Okay, now it's much better. Yeah, now it's.
Recording in progress.
Turn down the volume.
As of now, it is okay, fine. So what should actually won't be silent as well. You can see. That I would like to see. Only there's no microphone to speak loud. Yeah.
Okay.
There's no microphone.
Oh, fine. I think it's a small room, so.
Yeah, it will capture.
Sure. Okay, so so I mean we are so thank you everybody for joining here, and we are sorry I mean there has been this interruption because of the change in our lecture hall. So good morning to our speaker and good afternoon to all of you. So we are privileged to have Professor Seth Lloyd from MIT USA as the 13th speaker in our series of lectures to celebrate International Year of Quantum Science and Technology. Just to introduce to our speaker, our center is known as SECURE, Center for Quantum Engineering, Science and Education. We are a unit of a larger set of centers called TCG Quest, TCG Centers for Research and Education in Science and Technology. Our center SECURE has 9 faculty members. Our director, Professor V.P. Das, has not been able to join today because he had to attend another conference. And I think Dr. Siddharth Rai was in touch with our speaker. And okay, so our speaker obtained his bachelor degree from Harvard University and master's from Cambridge University in History and Philosophy of Sciences. So he has very diverse interests. And then he obtained his PhD from Rockefeller University. In few words, I mean, his major interests are in quantum information and control theory. But he has wide interest in all areas of quantum sciences, with forays in philosophy, biology, and many other fields. But from our center point of view, he is L in HHL algorithm. Okay, because lots of students and faculty members here are working or using HHL algorithm. Okay, so from our point of view, this is what is most important. Okay, but he has done pioneering work in many other areas, including quantum machine learning, and especially in quantum metrology. And as well as he has been working in limits of quantum computation. So okay, so without, you know, without continuing further, we can request our speaker to give his talk on natural intelligence, the information processing power of life. So, Professor Lloyd.
Thank you very much, Shivdas. And my apologies for not being able to attend on the earlier date. Actually, the internet was out here in Spain, and here I actually have my co-author Michelle Riley here. Michelle, could you come over here and say hi to the audience?
Hello. Nice to meet everyone. And I hope you enjoy the talk. We worked really hard on it.
Thank you. Thank you.
Great. So the work on this talk comes from about 20 years ago, actually. Now, I wrote papers on the fundamental information processing power of computers. What are the physical limits to computation, and how much computation could be performed, even in principle, by any system, given the amount of energy that it have, and given thermodynamic constraints such as entropy, including going from, the most microscopic systems to like elementary particles to the universe itself. And more recently, I was talking with Philip Kurian, who was trying to calculate the information processing power of living systems. And I came up with somewhat different numbers for how much information processing powers in living systems. And I'm going to share those with you today. And here's this is my idea of a PowerPoint slide. Sorry if it doesn't make much sense. Here we go. Over here is the sun. It's located in space. It's radiating out lots of photons to the Earth. There are about 10 to the 17th photons per second, visible photons per second falling on Earth. And out of that, a large fraction, between 10 and 20%, is actually absorbed by living systems like these trees here, like phytoplankton in the ocean. And then this energy is then used to process information and supports all life on Earth. I'm just going to go and explain how much information processing is going on. So using the word compute, we're going to compare the amount of compute in life with the amount of compute in artificial computers. And I'll just tell you right away, it's a very large amount. The amount of information processing that's going on in your own cells, in each human being's cells, in terms of biomolecules rearranging themselves, performing bio-ops, is the same as the amount of information processing going on in all the computers, supercomputers, cell phones, large language models, et cetera, on Earth altogether. So your body, the bio-ops going on your body, you're performing the same number as the entire set of artificial information processors. Artificial information processors out there. So in case you were feeling small, now you can feel big. Okay, so how do I calculate this? How do we, Michelle and I, calculate this number? Well, this work really stems from, in my case, from work that I started doing back in the early 1990s, around 1990, about how you build a quantum computer. Recall that this was in the dark ages of quantum computing. There were only about a dozen or half a dozen people working on quantum computing at this point, and people like Richard Feynman, who wrote one of the early papers on quantum computing in 1982, said, we can't even imagine how you could build a quantum computer. So during my PhD and then during postdocs with Murray Gell-Mann, I started figuring out how you could do that. And I realized that essentially any quantum degree of freedom could be a qubit in a quantum computer. So an electron spin could be spinning up or spinning down, and spinning sideways is up and down at the same time. A photon can be polarized like this or polarized like that. And that's another qubit, or polarized like this, or circularly polarized like that, or circularly polarized like this. So these are all quantum degrees of freedom which can go into computation. And the reason that quantum mechanics supports computation is that quantum mechanics makes nature digital. So can you see my pointer, by the way?
Yes.
You can. Okay, good. And I should say that along the way, I want to stop. I'm going to stop, and I'd prefer it if people asked questions, either in person or in the chat, if you happen to be on the chat. If you could just ask questions as I'm going on, and I will then look at the chat at regular intervals, basically, at every other slide or so, and slide or every other slide. And then when your questions come up, I will try to answer them. And my first question is, can someone please put something on the chat so that I can see that it's working? That's my question for you.
Just say hello.
Okay, great.
Yeah.
Thank you, Sujan. Thank you, Sujan. All right, we're cooking. Okay. Good. So we're in good shape. So here you go. So in what way is nature digital? Well, I already described the digital nature of photons, which I'm calling phi for photon here, but we'll call them gamma later. And the digital nature of electrons. And here is a typical bit flip in a quantum computer. I have an electron that's spin up, registering the quantum state 0, and a photon comes in and flips it, transferring its own angular momentum to the electron, flipping it become spin down. So the flipping of a qubit or of a bit is an elementary logical operation in a quantum computer. And indeed, oh, yeah, sorry. On my screen, I haven't been able to turn off the reactions. So if I go like this, it says I'm giving a thumbs up. So thumbs up to all of you. Oh, there we go. Seems to be fireworks there. So going back to the slides here, here's a picture of a hydrogen atom. It has a proton and an electron. I've drawn the little wave corresponding to electron. This has lots of wiggles, so this electron is in some kind of high energy state. And the photon can come in and be absorbed by the electron, or for that matter, the electron can go to a lower energy state and emit a photon. And this is, again, another example of how you do a quantum logic operation in a quantum computation. And now let's look at things that are more related to biology and chemistry. So if I take the neat thing about quantum mechanics is it means there's only a discrete number, and actually rather small number, of elementary particles, quarks, electrons, photons, neutrinos, and nuclei, neutrons, protons, and electrons can only combine into a relatively small number of atoms, only around 100 elements or so. And now these atoms can combine in different kinds of molecules, and now we get a much larger variety of molecules. But you see that each one of these is just storing information. So for instance, here I have two hydrogens. They could either be free hydrogens or they could form a hydrogen molecule. So their form is different, and so they're forming information. And in particular here, I've shown a reaction where I have a particular set of inputs for a reaction. Two hydrogen molecules here and there collide with one oxygen molecule with two oxygen atoms, and then they reform themselves, they reconfigure themselves to form two water molecules together with photons in the form of heat. So you see the information required to specify the state beforehand has been transformed into a new form of information afterwards. So this transformation of information or processing of information is in living systems is what we're going to call an elementary biological operation. And of course, then in living systems, these molecules, by a process, by the way, we have no idea how we went from simple chemical reactions before there was life on Earth to having complicated living systems. It's one of the biggest mysteries in science. In fact, it's kind of an embarrassment that we know more about the history of the universe and the beginning of the universe than we know about the beginning of life on Earth. But somehow, these chemical reactions bootstrap their way into more complicated information registering systems, such as DNA, with 2 bits of information per base pair of DNA, because there are 4 different possible base pairs for the DNA. And then in another piece of biological information processing, the DNA gets transcribed into RNA. So each set of base pairs in DNA makes single-stranded RNA. And then the base pairs in RNA, again, via the genetic code, which encodes how the code of the genetic code gets encoded as proteins, then constructs proteins. And here proteins are complex molecules. I've drawn them here. This is like a sheet-like structure. And these proteins then fold up to become biologically active. I see I've drawn this little fold here line right here. And actually, I should mention that one of our collaborators in this broader project is Demis Hassabis, the head of DeepMind, who is just won the Nobel Prize last year for protein folding in chemistry. Okay, so are there questions? This is the end of the introduction. So I'm going to wait while people can write their questions. I will just go further and keep on going. But just pop your questions up in the chat. I have it up here so people can talk about it, can listen, can communicate about it. Okay, so we've seen that these chemical reactions, here I have 2 hydrogen molecules and 2 oxygen molecules coming and forming 2 water molecules plus light. These are information processing. And a nice way to think about chemical information processing is that chemical reactions form a natural language. So a natural language is defined by a set of production rules where you have 2 inputs, A plus B, for example, hydrogen plus oxygen. And then you have outputs to the reaction, for example, water plus heat and entropy. Because chemical reactions, basically, they use free energy, they transform the inputs into the outputs, and then they create entropy in the process. So here's a set of rules for some artificial simple chemistry that A and B can go to AB. That's association of 2 components, chemical components, to make a more complicated chemical component. Or AB and CD can interact with each other, and then if free energy prefers it, the D and the A will then meet up together afterwards, as will the B and the C, again accompanied by dissipation and heat. Or here's something where EF could be an unstable molecule that then dissociates into an E molecule and an F molecule, again with heat. And then life consists of complicated sequences of these chemical reactions that perform the highly complex sequences that are going on within our own bodies and within every living cell. Now, there's a very important feature about such languages with production rules is that languages with production rules are equivalent to computation, to a form of computation. So it's quite clear that I could actually take a digital computer and then model what these production rules can construct, the sort of chains of molecules they can construct. But actually, because these actually have a logical structure, they're like AND gates, OR gates, excuse me, and copy gates, which form the basis for digital computation. It's rather simple to show that chemical reactions and the natural language, the set of strings or molecules that can be produced by chemical reactions, this natural language is computationally universal. That is, it has the same computational power as a universal Turing machine, or as the computer through which I'm talking with you here, or as a cell phone. So from a formal information processing perspective, chemistry is computationally universal and has the same potential power as the artificial computers that we see around us, which is good because you and I are all just chemical systems and our brains are electrochemical systems. And so indeed, we can perform chemical systems, become complicated biological systems where it's effectively a computation. And then these are computationally universal. So are there questions here? I'm not seeing any questions here. So please pop a question onto the chat, or if you're there in the room, please raise your hand and ask a question. Okay, so for example, so in biochemistry, just to summarize what's going to happen here, we're going to call the breaking or formation of a chemical bond to be a bio-op. So in a biological system, these chemical reactions are logical operations, biological logical operations, or biological operations that underlie the computation, which is life. And so we're going to count these bio-ops, how many elementary operations are going into biology. Okay. So before we do that, let me just show you how complex and remarkable this biological computation is. And I'm going to do that by following the sequence of bio-ops that are initiated by the absorption of a single photon in photosynthesis. So just to show you the diversity of what's going on in living systems in these bio-ops. So here we have here, I'm sorry, the slide is a little busy, but we'll follow it. It goes around from here to there. We'll follow it around. A photon comes in and is absorbed by a chlorophyll molecule in a leaf. We call this a bio-op because we could go from a situation where we have a photon into a chlorophyll molecule in an unexcited state to a chlorophyll molecule in an excited state. And here I've drawn a close-up of such a chlorophyll molecule. At its basis, it's a little porphyrin ring, and then it's optically active. So when the photon comes in, it breaks a covalent bond and creates an exciton, which is an excited electron-hole pair. So the energy, most of the energy in the photon has gone into this exciton. Something in general like 40% of the photon's energy of several electron volts ends up in this exciton. Okay. Now, what happens then? Here's our little exciton here. This is a picture of our photo antenna, our photocomplex. It has a whole series of these chromophores inside it in large arrays, which may have anywhere between dozens to thousands of these chromophores. And the exciton then hops from chromophore to chromophore, actually in a way which is highly quantum mechanical. My first work in working on quantum biology, along with Alain Aspero-Guzik, was to look at the interplay between quantum coherence and decoherence in this excitonic hopping. And in fact, quantum coherence in this excitonic hopping is extremely important for the high efficiency of this of biological computation. So each hop through the photo antenna we regard as another bio-op. It hops through. These bio-ops are very efficient. Very little of this energy is actually dissipated as the exciton gets to the reaction center inside the molecule, where the reaction center splits the exciton into the hole over here and the electron over here.
One quick question.
Yes, absolutely.
That's, this exciton can follow many parallel paths, like it's like a superposition.
Yes, so actually, right. So there's in general, it's the if you look, there's what Alain Aspero-Guzik and I and our students and postdocs showed was that there's kind of an optimal level of coherence and decoherence. So an exciton in one chlorophyll molecule, in one chromophore, will coherently spread out to a number of the nearby chromophores, and then it will get decohered. And so indeed, it doesn't follow a fully coherent path where it's like a path integral going all the way through this photo antenna, because actually that would not be very efficient, because the photo antenna has little irregularities and you'd get Anderson localization. So it turns out that there's a really beautiful interplay between coherence and decoherence, where the coherence extends over 5 or 10 chromophores at once. Does that help? Did I answer your question?
Yeah, yeah.
Great. Okay. Now let's follow this excited electron as it goes to generate chemical energy. And the next step, and I'm sorry, this is rather busy, I should have probably simplified it, is a mitochondria. So a mitochondria have an outer membrane, which is what I've drawn like here, and then it's got an inner membrane, which I've drawn like this. And the inner membrane is very, if you study biology, you know the inner membrane has lots and lots of folds and is very, very spread out, and that's to maximize the amount of surface area between the inner part of the inner membrane and the outer part of the inner membrane. Because the inner membrane separates an inside part, which is going to become negatively charged, with an outside part, which is going to become positively charged. And it's this charge differential which will then be used to drive ATP synthesis and drive the rest of all the energy that we use in life. And how does this happen? Well, what happens is here's this excited electron. Here it comes into basically a channel of sites in through the inner membrane, which is a proton pump. And what happens is the electron hops from site to site, going downhill in energy and pumping a proton with it. Because the electron is negatively charged, it drags this proton along and pumps it uphill, so up the chemical gradient, the electrochemical gradient, to create an electrochemical gradient between the inside and the outside. And actually, in this electron transport chain, there are actually four different pumps that actually the electron goes through 4 different pumps, pumping several protons up there in the whole process. So each excited electron within the order of an electron volt of energy then can pump on several protons from the inside to the outside. So this mitochondrium then becomes like a battery with a charge, an electrochemical charge differential between the positive part and the negative part. Okay, so each of these, just as the same way that each of these hops through the photoantenna is a bio-op, then each of these hops of the electron through these pumps is a bio-op. Each proton pumped through also is bio-ops. So we're going to count these as well. And now, in the beautiful fashion of life, there's this remarkable apparatus, which again goes through the membrane. I haven't drawn it here. It would be maybe somewhere like here, there's a complex set of proteins together in a device, a motor, called ATP synthase, which synthesizes ATP, and ATP is the energy source for life. And what happens is that ADP and PI come in. This is kind of, and then they get converted to ATP by this kind of nice process. So just in the same way, in these proton pumps over here, the electron goes chunk, 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 chunk through the proton pump, and each chunk is a bio-op, a bit flip. Now, when it's run in the other fashion, we have protons that are going now downhill through this electrochemical gradient, and they have a rotor. This rotor goes chunk, 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 chunk. As each proton goes into it, the rotor turns like that, and then it supplies the energy via this complex up here, which is also turning around to take this ADP and PI and transfer that energy into ATP to synthesize chemical bond, a covalent bond in ATP that holds the energy that we then use for living systems. And since if this process is, since was already asked about quantum coherence, so these processes here, the electron transport, the exciton transport is definitely quite coherent, though it has lots of decoherence. These processes here of the electron going downhill in its energy gradient to pump protons, or the proton going back downhill through its energy gradient to synthesize ATP, while they might be coherent for a very brief period of time because they are dissipative, because some fraction of the energy is dissipated in this process, then they're not that coherent. Okay?
One question here. What does the hole do there? The electron comes out and does this, everything that you have explained. But the hole is remaining there. What is it going to do?
What is the goal, did you say?
The hole, the exciton breaks, and the electron comes and does all these things that you described.
Yeah.
What's the role of the hole there?
Oh, the role of the hole, yes. Okay. The hole itself, yeah, the hole itself. Now that's a good question. In general, what happens in this reaction center is you end up splitting water. So you take water molecules and you split them into hydrogen H plus and OH minus, and then the electron. I believe that I'm not an expert on this part about photosynthesis, so the hole participates in that part. And then the energetic electron gets transferred over to this electron transfer chain. So I have to say that my knowledge of biology is very skimpy because, well, it's very detailed when it comes to quantum mechanical processes, like the quantum mechanics of photosynthesis, uh, uh, or other quantum mechanical effects in biological systems. But anywhere outside of that, I know very little. So there is a question about what is PI, and I don't know the answer to that as well, but I will try to answer it. Sorry. So okay, here we go. ADP is adenosine diphosphate, and PI is inorganic phosphate. So in this picture that I have here, then in this picture that I have, there we have ADP is adenosine diphosphate, and PI is an inorganic phosphate, and then they get synthesized together into ATP, which is adenosine triphosphate, and so which then has more energy than it's got a whole extra covalent bond worth of energy. So the ATP has about an electron volt worth of energy that can be used to perform biological functions. And you can see it's the limit of my knowledge because I had to look it up on Google to answer your question. All right. So here we go. So now let's go to the fun part of this, which is, in fact, and this is a good point because now what is going to happen is I'm just going to, having showed what this happens, I'm just going to now calculate how many of these biological bit flips, these biological operations are being performed in living systems. And so at this point, the next few slides, I'm just going to ask you to kind of hold on to your hats. But now would be a good time if you have further questions or want clarification, or you wish to object to something saying, no, I think a bio-op is something different. Now would be a good time to do that.
So what exactly do you mean by bio-op? I mean, is it the same thing in all biological processes, or you will mean different thing in different biological processes?
Okay, so in computation, a logical operation, an elementary logical operation, really there are only a few of them. There's the AND operations, OR operations, NOT operations, and copy operations. And those four elemental operations are able to, you can do any computation using this. In the natural chemical reactions, they form a natural language. So that there's a broader set of elementary operations, so of different kinds of chemical reactions. But what we're calling a bio-op is in these chemical reactions, including photochemistry, when photons come in, and when in these biological reactions, when a chemical bond, either a covalent bond or a hydrogen bond, is broken or is formed, we're going to call that a bio-op. So a chemical reaction typically involves several of these breaking and formation of chemical bonds, and each one is an elementary biological operation or bio-op.
But, no, but it can be chem op also, right? Why? Because here the biological molecule is involved necessarily, right? When you're breaking a bond, it can be any chemical, not necessarily some protein or some system.
Absolutely. So maybe we could say there's like, there's
chem op. Can you define something called chem op?
Yeah. Oh, good. Okay, good. So I like your way of thinking. This is great. So and indeed, Michelle and I almost put this in the paper. We didn't want to confuse people. So if we look at this slide right here with the fundamental digital nature of nature, we could call these very elementary things like physical ops, or quantum ops, where I have a quantum mechanical process, say that a photon is absorbed by electron. And then we can call these chemical processes chemops. So chemops are a specific type of physical operation. The chemops are made up of a bunch of physical ops. And then we have these bio-ops, which are chemical operations, chemops in the service of biology. And so then we have bio-ops. So the basic thing is a physical op, and then chem-ops are constructed out of physical ops, and bio-ops are constructed out of chemical ops. Is that okay? I'm actually just trying to formulate it in a way that answers your question. So that sounds, it's an idea, right? It's a good idea. And so then in these chemical reactions, then for any chemical reactions, we could call this a chem-op. But what we're going to do to call bio-ops is we're just going to look at the chemical reactions, including photochemical reactions, which underlie living processes. So is that okay? So for instance,
we are just talking about breaking of a chemical bond, right? Which has nothing to do with any biological process necessarily, right? It is just a chemical process, right?
Right, exactly. But we're going to focus on the chemical processes that go in, and these are the kinds of bio-ops we're talking about. So for chemops, they could be anything like this. And indeed, there's constant breaking and formation of hydrogen bonds in water, right? So it's constantly breaking and formation of hydrogen bonds. We don't count that, right? We don't count that. We don't count those. And indeed, what we're going to count, you'll see in a moment how I calculate this, because the thing is that biological systems are extremely efficient at taking the free energy that comes from the sun and turning it into energy that's actually used in these kinds of chemical reactions like ATP synthesis or DNA replication. So all those biochemical interactions are extremely efficient. And so that is to say, only a few percent of the, maybe 10% of the energy is lost at each step along the way. And so, in fact, a very large fraction, maybe like between 10 and 40% of the energy that's actually going in to the system by photosynthesis actually ends up going into these chemical ops, chem ops, that have a direct biological function. Does that help?
Yeah. Okay, thank you.
Great. Okay, good. So here we go. So now we can do this calculation in a rather simple fashion. So the free energy for each of these bio-ops is on the order of 0.1 to a few electron volts. 1 to 3 electron volts is the energy in covalent bonds. Around 10, and the energy in hydrogen bonds is 10 times less. And then van der Waals forces are also important, but because van der Waals forces are actually down at the level of the thermal energy of KT, then these are kind of more in the form of like hydrogen bonds always breaking and reforming in water, though some of them are important for bio-ops. But we're just going to use, for instance, covalent bond formation like in ATP, or the use of a covalent bond in ATP to help copy base pairs of DNA. We're going to use those as our bio-ops. And then also hydrogen bonding in protein folding, right? Very important hydrogen bonding in protein folding that holds the proteins together as they fold. Each one of those is going to be a bio-op. So the amount of energy per bio-op is between 1/10 of an electron volt to around 1 electron volt. And by the way, we're not going to be overly precise about this. We just want to get the exponent of how many bio-ops there are to within, 1 or 2. We're not going to count them down to, like 55.3 bio-ops or anything like that. All right. An electron volt is 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th joules, famously. And also famously, 1 joule is about 1/4 of a calorie. And so if we look at, we do this, we take the amount of energy that's being used in calories and that's being transformed into bio-ops, then again, like something between 10 and 50% of this energy is actively going into these bio-ops because the whole each of this process is quite efficient. And so if we look at human beings, so human beings are 100-watt creatures. 100 watts is about 100 kilocalories per hour, which is around 2,400 kilocalories per day, which is a reasonable diet. I probably eat a little bit more than that, a little more than I should, of 2,400 kilocalories a day. But human beings kind of, by and large, are around 100-watt creatures. We exert more when we're exercising, we exert less when we're sleeping, but that's kind of where we are. So now let's just look at how many bio-ops are going on per second are going on in the human metabolism. Again, a very substantial fraction of these bio-ops, this 100 watts, are being converted into bio-ops at around 0.1 to 1 EV per bio-op. And so we see we have 100 watts divided by 1.6 around, plus or minus 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th joules per bio-op. This gives 10 to the 21 bio-ops per second. So this is like a zeta op per second. Zeta is 10 to the 21.
This is much more than the present-day supercomputer.
Yeah, exactly. And indeed,
It's much more than exaflops.
Absolutely, exactly. Good point. And so I'm just saying this is a straightforward calculation to do. And once you accept the definition of a bio-op as being, just what it is, then there are lots of them being performed. And by the way, these bio-ops are really essential for life because, if you try to live on 1/4 of this, you won't be alive, right? You need, this is the amount of, you need on this order of kilocalories. And if you don't get that, then this computation and information processing, biological information processing just doesn't work. So,
but actually these bio-ops are taking place in parallel, right? It is not that right?
They're highly parallel. They're not, doing things like our brain, for example. Our brain, if you look at, okay, actually I should have included a slide on this, but so our brain has around 10 billion neurons. Each neuron has around 10,000, 1,000 or 10 to 10,000 synapses. And when a synapse fires, it releases 1,000 to 10,000 transmitter chemicals. And so neurotransmitters, and each binding event for a neurotransmitter chemical molecule coming in and binding to a receptor in a synapse is a bio-op. And if you do that, you get, 10 to the 10th times 10 to the 4th times 10 to the 3. It's around 10 to the 18th ops per second. So you see that in terms of bio-ops. So that's really only a small fraction of of what's actually the number of bioops that are being performed by all our cells. And the reason is because the brain has these neurons as these complex electrochemical objects, and they need a lot of extra energy to generate the spike trains that actually set the synapses firing. So that extra energy that goes into communication of these spike trains down the axons of the neuron takes a lot of extra energy that then gets dissipated and is not going directly into bioops. So our brain takes up, a quarter of the energy in the body or some crazy amount like that. But in fact, the bioops is a smaller number. Okay, yeah, so now since people brought it up, let's compare this with electronic computers. Yeah, this is a lot more than electronic computers. It's not exaflops, it's zetaflops. And so let's just look at all the computers in the world. You have, around, let's say, 100 billion processors, including supercomputers, GPUs, cell phones, etc. It's kind of roughly the number. And each performing around, 10 billion ops per second on average. And you get 10 to the 21 electronic operations per second in all the computers in the world. The living cells in your body are performing the same amount of biological information processing measured in bioops as all the electronic computers on Earth measured in electronic operations. And that's just what it is, right? By the way, I calculated this number this way. This is my first estimate. And then you go and you look at how many computers there are and you ask ChatGPT to estimate this number and you get all these different estimates, but all the estimates are around this. You might get, a little bit less, or you might get a little bit more by, an order of magnitude or so. But it's the same, basically. It's the same. So your body, the living cells in your body are performing the same number of bioops per second as all the computers on Earth. And that's because these computers are actually very inefficient. To perform an electronic operation takes tens to hundreds of billion times the amount of energy that it takes to do a bioop. Okay, so we'll talk about that more in a second because, about the relative amounts of free energy being used by computers and by human beings. So now let's actually go, while we're on this road, let's just continue and look at how many bioops are being performed by all living systems. I mean, once you've got the tool, you might as well use it. So the solar power following on Earth is directly is around 1.4 kilowatts per square meter, of which, some fraction, maybe between 20 to 40% is reflected. So 20 to 40% of the 1.4 kilowatts, so it's about 1 kilowatt per square meter. Now here's the Earth, and the Earth by definition, a quarter of the circumference is 10,000 kilometers. And so then when you take the cross-sectional area of the Earth in square meters and multiply it by 1 kilowatt per square meter, you get the power falling on Earth is around 1.7 times 10 to the 17th watts. So it's a large number. It's, it's around a little less than a billion watts. And of this, between 10 and 40% actually falls on living plants. Something like 40% of land is covered by green plants. And of the absorption of light in the water, again, a comparable amount, 40%, is absorbed by photosynthetic algae and bacteria in the water. So a really large fraction of this, let's say 10%, is captured in this process of getting electrons getting photons in and getting energy to actually perform bioops. So I should mention in passing that biomass photosynthesis is only about 1 to 3% efficient in creating biomass. That is, the mass of living plants, the energy in living plants, and in the biomass of living plants. So, but that's because actually, that's not what life is about. It's not just biomass. It's doing it's doing bio-ops. And most of that energy goes into doing bio-ops. So here there were about 10 to the 16th watts that are being going to photosynthesis. Kind of amazing, right? Something like 10% of the light falling on Earth is actually being used by living systems. Quite remarkable. And then again, we divide it by, 1.6 times 10 to the minus 19th joules per bio-op, and we get around 10 to the 35 bio-ops per second for everything on Earth. So all living systems on Earth. So, which is, so that's maybe not that surprising. I mean, if you can calculate, again, these numbers, I check them this way and that way and that way, and this all every which way, and other ways you can do this. You say, oh, how many living cells are there on Earth? What's the metabolic rate of each individual cells? And you end up with essentially basically the same number, plus with the exponent, plus or minus 1 or plus or minus 1, basically, maybe plus or minus 2. So that's the order of bio-ops per second that are being performed. It's a vast amounts of bio-ops. And the great majority of it is taking place in things like, single-celled photosynthetic bacteria in plants. And then we at kind of the top of the food chain, we're doing considerably less of it. But there's a lot of biological information processing going on. And just for the heck of it, let's compare, because I realized that I'm kind of we're getting near the end of this. But we'll just go down the full course, and we ask how many bio-ops have been performed by life since life began on Earth, which happened around 4 billion years ago. Well, it's a simple calculation. We have 10 to the 35 bio-ops per second, 4 times 10 to the 9th years. There are pi times 10 to the 7th seconds in a year. By the way, this is a very useful number. If you wish to remember the number of seconds in a year, it's very close to pi times 10 to the 7th. And this gives us around 10 to the 52 bio-ops in the entire history of the planet. So it's a very large number. And if we compare this with electronic computers doing their, zettaflop per second, over the course of a year, pi times 7 seconds per year, and then Moore's law, which says that this number has been doubling, though actually doubling, every couple of years, which means most of this computation has been happening in the last few years, we get around, 10 to the 28 or 10 to the 29 electronic operations in total, most of which have been performed quite recently. And I suspect that this, I believe, let's see, Moore's law, the number of doublings for 3 orders of magnitude is 10 doublings for 3 orders of magnitude. So these are 24 apart. So this would take about, if Moore's law continues for the next 300 years, we might get there. But it doesn't seem likely that Moore's law will continue for the next 300 years. In fact, you can kind of think of the growth.
It's almost saturated, Moore's law.
Yeah, it's already oversaturated, right? I mean, it's already oversaturated. It's already oversaturated. And the thing is, actually, if you look at life on Earth, right, from the biological record, there was a Moore's law for life on Earth, and there was some time frame for the doubling of life on Earth. It wasn't, 2 years. But it was something close to like tens of millions of years, or 100 million years, and very rapidly over, really the blink of an eye in cosmological terms, when it grows, it very rapidly, photosynthetic organisms rapidly took over, So there was a Moore's law that saturated very rapidly, and we've been, living at the saturation stage with minor improvements ever since. And in fact, that's probably, thank you for, if you bring it up, like Moore's law saturating. When Moore's law saturates, that's when you really have to focus on the software rather than the hardware, right? Because you have to focus on more efficient use of the information processing power you have than rather just trying to kill everything off by having more, more raw compute power. And that's a stage that society will soon have arrived at. I don't know how soon, but I don't think it will be 100 years. Okay, so now let's keep on going, and let's actually ask, How much, what about the worry about, artificial general intelligence will take over the world and kill off human beings because it wants to eat them and take all this energy human beings are using and use it for itself? Well, actually, it's already the case that the amount of energy that's been consumed by computers versus living systems is much larger. And I did this calculation just for the United States because this information is readily available, that the total computers, largely from server farms in the United States, is around half a terawatt of power, 5 times 10 to the 11th watts. And if we take human beings at 100 watts per person and around 500 million people, then we get 5 times 10 to the 10th watts. So computers are already, their metabolism, the computer metabolism is already consuming 10 times as much as all the human beings on Earth. And yet each individual human being is performing more elementary bio-operations per second, elementary, physical, chemical, biological, logical operations per second than all the computers on Earth. And indeed, you kind of say that it is true that large language models are extremely impressive, but when you measure them in terms of tons of carbon generated per IQ point, that's like, whoa, that's a rather expensive IQ point. Okay, so actually, and that brings us to the end of the talk. So I would actually say that artificial intelligence has some way to go before it can match the power and sophistication of natural intelligence. And let me just say a few words about this. So, of course, the logical operations in artificial intelligence is based on human language. The original idea of Turing, who also, when he invented the Turing machine, the notion of universal computation, he pretty much right away started to talk about artificial intelligence, what he called machine intelligence and how this would work. And he really nailed a lot of it. He said, okay, we're going to have training sets. We're going to have supervised learning in which human supervisors are teaching the machines what's important in these training sets. He already had this really thought through by the early 1950s. But artificial intelligence is based on human logic, on Boolean logic, and then on universal computation. And the languages of universal computation, computer languages, are based on human languages. Human language is a set of instructions that allow you to perform what's called in linguistics, or I'm sorry, in the theory of computation, fully recursive or recursively enumerable languages, which are ones that can actually produce all possible computable structures. Now, as we saw before, actually chemical reactions, because they're really, you look at them, it's like they're just like logical operations. And it's not hard to show that, very simple sets of chemical reactions, if they can produce, arbitrarily complicated chemicals, are, computationally universal in the sense that the language that they produce is a fully recursively enumerable language. And indeed, that's why chemistry, this is a good explanation, even though we don't know the details, why chemical reactions were able to bootstrap their way up into creating living systems. And again, we have no idea how they did that, but they are computationally very powerful, computationally universal. So going back to the difference between artificial intelligence and natural intelligence. So artificial intelligence is based on human language and on human and law-based chemistry and chemops, which have the same computational power, right? They are also computationally universal. But what's going on in living systems is most living systems is not about human language. It's not about computer language. So it's about reproduction, and reproduction with variation, which goes into natural selection, which goes into the universal computation, which is the universal biological computation of all life on Earth. and perhaps even of all life in the universe. So our bias towards artificial intelligence, and actually indeed our fear of artificial general intelligence, in case you're fearful of that, and also the fact that people kind of get sucked at GPT, comes because our AIs and human language and human species are very locked into each other. It's sort of an inward-looking spiral, whereas if you actually look at natural intelligence, that is to say, the information processing of all living things, it's doing something much larger that happens to include human beings and human language as one piece of it. And indeed, since actually humans evolved naturally and then humans evolved computers naturally, you can even think of artificial intelligence as, one little electronic branch over here of natural intelligence in general. So I think that I will end up by saying that, yeah, just to summarize, natural intelligence, the information processing power of biological systems is very large. It is based on the same digital kind information processing as human information processing and as electronic information processing, but because it's based on this at the chemical level, performing chemops, and I by the way, I really like the word chemops, and the fact that you brought it up means I think that Michelle and I might just reinsert it in the paper. Then because living systems are based on chemops, and chemops are, 1,000,000 to 1,000,000,000 times more efficient than EOPS, or for that matter, than, in fact, neural ops as well, if you just think of neural ops as spike trains, as opposed to neural spike trains. So this power of natural intelligence is vastly greater in terms of its overall compute power. And unless we really screw things up on Earth, it's likely to remain vastly greater. Then I think I'll just stop right there and thank you for your attention. Great, and I'm happy to, your questions have been good, so keep them coming.
So there is a question in the chat box.
Right, so there is the question, are excitons reaching the reaction center by following a certain path out of all possible paths in parallel? Some sort of optimization problem? Yeah, that's a really good question. I already talked about, the interplay between, let me go back to the slide that has this little picture of this right here. Yeah, the interplay between coherence and decoherence in this exciton transport through the photosynthetic antenna. Now, actually, what happens is that, in fact, the exciton takes something close to kind of a decoherent, it's an accurate way to describe it is a decoherent quantum walk through this complex. And it doesn't follow one path, it follows typically multiple paths and takes a random walk through all possible ones. And the reason is energy efficiency. So if the exciton were just to take a single path through it, then that path would actually have to have a significantly larger free energy drop going along that path. And then as it moves from where it's absorbed in the antenna to the reaction center, then it would lose much more energy. And in fact, this particular process, the energy transport between when an electron is created by absorption of a photon and this hopping down through this photosynthetic antenna, it's a very gentle slope, and only something like a few percent of the chemical of the energy in the exciton is lost as it gets to the reaction center. So in fact, it's much more like a random walk that eventually finds its way to the reaction center. When it gets to the reaction center, then there is a free energy drop and it's captured by the reaction center and its energy goes into charge separation, water splitting, etc. So an excellent question.
I have a question. So Professor Lloyd, Shivdas here. So thing is, compared to artificial intelligence, like when you're talking about the natural living organisms, so the computations, do they need less power for far less power compared to the computers that we use?
Yeah, so I mean, if you look at if you look at our Michelle and I posted our paper on the archive just came out on Monday on this. It's called the same thing, Natural Intelligence, Information Processing Power of Biological Systems. And the if you look at the current energetics of computers are the following. So just a sketch of it. So if you look at the capacitance of transistors in computers where you're storing bits of information, so that capacitance, these things are on the order of, uh, you know, about around a nanometer or so, or a few nanometers in size. And the capacitance together with the voltage, it's like, I think if they're 5 nanometer scale or 2.5 nanometer scale transistors with like a like sub-nanometer scale gap between the parallel plate, and it's around a volt, then you get that the energy is around 1 million to 10 million electron volts. So you need about 1 million or 10 million electron volts. And then that gets dissipated when you run the transistor. But then actually there's a lot more dissipation elsewhere in the computer in the various signaling processes as well. So we're actually quite a long way away from being able to have the same kind of efficiency. And indeed, if you think of it for just a second, you realize that if you're operating your transistors at a volt, which is actually, they're a little bit more, like this band gap, if they're at a volt and you want to have an op, it just, take up 1 electron volts, then you have to have transistors that have, or capacitors that have a single electron on them. So you need single electron transistors, single electron capacitors, and indeed, an atom or a covalent bond is pretty much just a single electron or a 2 electron capacitor that stores around an electron volt of energy. So you'd have to have artificial systems go down, operate at the atomic and molecular level in order to have the same level of efficiency.
Okay, any more questions? Okay, so I mean, you are talking about, amount of bio-op, which are taking place inside a human being, right? But we have a lot of different life forms, right? So everywhere we have these bio-ops, per second, which are going on if you want to compute, right, in total.
Yeah.
Right, so I mean, and there is a limit to the energy which we are getting from the sun, right? So can we put some kind of limit that how much biomass can be supported?
That's a really good question. So here we go. So we remember humans are 10 to the 21 bio-ops per second, and all living systems are at around 10 to the 35 bio-ops per second. So there's a difference of around 10 to the 14th. Now, of those bio-ops, only some fraction is a relatively small fraction is being turned into living matter and biomass, maybe 1%, let's say. But then also at the same time, living systems are dying, and their biomass is being repurposed in the environment. Indeed, as human beings, we pick fruit, we pick the apple and we eat it. So we recycle this biomass. Though this actually does tell you that human beings and in fact other living systems are using only small amount of the watts per second of the energy that's falling on Earth. So yeah, I mean, human beings, we were having this nice discussion earlier about Moore's law, and that computers are falling off. You can have exponential growth, and exponential growth will grow until you've saturated the resource that limits it. And computers are already reaching that limit, though we're devoting more and more power to computers. Human beings have definitely reached this limit. There are possibly too many human beings on the planet. Can't really support more of them. So yeah. So, but I don't know. There's plenty. I think there's plenty more scope for interaction between human and artificial intelligence and natural intelligence.
Okay, so I mean, since we are talking about quantum mechanics and biology, I mean, is there any evidence in any biological process where entanglement is playing any role?
Oh yeah, absolutely. Yeah, so indeed, I mentioned before our work on quantum mechanics and photosynthesis. And so quantum mechanics quantum mechanics is playing and quantum coherence is playing an important role in excitonic transport and photosynthesis. Then other places where it's known to play a role are in avian navigation. There's and for magnetic field sensitivity, birds are sensitive to the Earth's magnetic field. And the Earth's magnetic field is, very tiny. It's a few Gauss, which is, it's like 10 to the minus 4 Tesla, all right? It's like very small. And this is a really quantum mechanical mechanism. What happens is a blue photon comes in and it breaks a covalent bond. And you now have these two electrons, which say are in a singlet state. And then they face different magnetic field environments because they're now in different places in the molecule or maybe in two different molecules. So they precess at two different rates and their Larmor frequencies are different in the Earth's magnetic field. And then they have to line up again in order to reform the bond to stop the biological process. That's the so-called radical pair mechanism for magnetic field sensing. And birds have this mechanism, and my collaborators Fabrizio Ambrosio and Kai Wang recently showed that, in fact, mouse stem cells, so muscle cells that you cut a muscle and the muscle the stem muscle precursor cells, myoblasts, leak out and they have to form new muscle fibers. And they tend to align these new myofibers, these new muscle fibers along the Earth's magnetic field. It's only takes place in the presence of blue light. So it seems to be the same mechanism. So there are definitely in places where quantum mechanics, sensitivity is important in sensing, then quantum mechanical mechanisms are there. I think it's quite remarkable that actually that living systems apparently quite a long time ago discovered the ability to use a quantum mechanical effect to detect the Earth's magnetic field. But in general, I think, if you say the place that quantum mechanics is really being used, of course, in biological systems is the fact that we only have quantum mechanics makes nature digital. So quantum mechanics, gives us atomic physics, and it gives us molecular physics, and it gives us chemistry, and chemistry gives us biology. It's this underlying digital nature of nature that quantum mechanics gives us.
The process you just now explained happens in European robin, right?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question?
The process that you have just now explained happens in the brain of European robin, right? And the evidence of entanglement?
Evidence of entanglement in the brain.
It's
that's
European
actually
robin?
okay. So there is the other place. So okay, when you look at the level of neural signaling, or for that matter, at the level of neurotransmitters diffusing across a synapse, that is a very decoherent process, and there's really no evidence of entanglement there. The one place that quantum mechanics, another place where quantum mechanics is thought to play an important role in biological systems is in receptor dynamics. So, you have a receptor on a cell, which is a particular protein, and then it spans the membrane of the cell, and then some particular molecule comes up. And then, as Linus Pauling showed, there's a lock and key mechanism where the molecule locks into the protein and then opens the lock and then opens a channel into the cell. And so the molecule can then be taken in by the cell. And by the way, for our cells, for human cells, and indeed for anything that's not directly doing photosynthesis, this is the primary mechanism whereby we get energy. Glucose molecule comes around, binds to receptor in the cell, says, aha, glucose molecule comes in. Anyway, this receptor binding dynamics is apparently quite sensitive to quantum mechanical features such as the vibrational frequency of the molecule. So if you change a hydrogen atom in the molecule to a deuterium atom, so you're changing the frequency of vibration of that particular chemical bond. It goes down by a factor of of the square root of 2, 1.414. You change that vibrational frequency, then there's evidence that this changes the efficiency of the binding to the receptor. So in fact, in the sense of smell, so in the olfactory receptors, it seems that fruit flies and dogs and maybe human beings can actually detect the difference between the vibrational properties of these different molecules. And there is a theory that this is also true in neurotransmitters and receptors in synapses that bind lithium. That is so that if you use a different isotope of lithium, when lithium, of course, is famously a psychoactive chemical and used to treat people with manic depression, and if you change the isotope of lithium, that this changes the properties of lithium and how it affects the brain. But that is definitely a quantum mechanical effect because it says that there's this vibrational, it's the additional phonons. So whatever the receptor is detecting, not only the presence of this molecule and its shape, but also even the vibrational, the phonon, the decomposition, the spectrum, the vibrational spectrum of the molecule. So that's certainly possible, and there's an accumulating amount of evidence that suggests that such mechanisms are going on. But that's not entanglement in the brain, and it's not, I should say, yes. There's, Roger Penrose and Stuart Hameroff has this idea that, there isn't massive entanglement in the brain having to do with assembly and disassembly of microtubules, but indeed, assembly and disassembly of microtubules is a chemical process, but it's very incoherent. It's highly dissipative and very incoherent. So not many people take that theory seriously.
Any more questions?
So just one more question. So what attribute of quantum mechanics, what feature of quantum mechanics do you attribute this superiority or the more sophistication of natural intelligence over artificial intelligence? So what foundationally, what is it that you could actually attribute this to?
Yeah,
Or-
I guess I already said this, so I'll re-emphasize it, that it's the quantum mechanics makes nature digital,
okay.
right? And it's in fact remember in the 19th century, you might not have been there, but I was there. No, if you remember in the 19th century that when people were trying to make classical models of light and atoms and molecules, they were having a terrible time. And in fact, when Darwin was contemplating what the genetic material might be, since it was clear from natural selection that there was some information carrying, entity that got passed on and then transformed, he was thinking of this as some kind of, a meter on a scale, a continuous variable. And there's this quote, and I've been trying to track this down, but he said something like, in order to get the exact wording, but the quote is something like, I can't understand in inheritance why everything is not just some shade of gray, right? Because it's very hard to think how discrete traits could be passed down. And in fact, Mendel, who was, looking at things at roughly the same time, noted, his observation said, oh, there's just these discrete genes that are being passed along. How can that be? And now we understand that this is because of the digital nature of DNA. and the genetic code. But that digital nature of DNA comes directly from the digital nature of chemistry. You know, it's like discrete molecules that can combine in some countable set of ways, not in shades of gray. So that is by far the most important aspect of quantum mechanics. But in terms of quantum coherence, then there are these, because the body, living systems are hot, wet places, quantum coherence plays a less important role because, you know, you're not going to get superconductivity in living systems anytime soon. Also, okay, I should say, in photochemistry, so in the absorption of light, so in photosynthesis, then that is very quantum mechanical in its nature. And this process whereby, I didn't really talk about this, but the process whereby a photon is absorbed in a chromophore to create an exciton and to change the configuration of the molecule, to break chemical bonds, that is often a complicated semi-coherent quantum mechanical process, as is this hopping of the exciton through the antenna. And in fact, if you want to think yourself quantum mechanical in the brain, then a really nice place where this is going on is in the eye. So the eye is extremely sensitive, can detect individual photons. And the way that works is a photon, you have basically in the membrane, you have a channel, which is called a rhodopsin funnel. So there's a funnel-shaped molecule like rhodopsin. And in the mouth of this at the narrow point of the funnel, there is a small molecule called retinol, which actually I note is now popular as used as a skin cream. But anyway, retinol. Retinol is normally, I think it's in a straight configuration, and then the mouth of the funnel is closed. But when a photon comes in, it's absorbed by the retinol. When it goes into another configuration, let's say it's in a bent configuration to be with, and then it straightens out, and then it opens up the funnel. And this funnel remains open for long enough time for something like 10 or 100,000 calcium ions to flow through, and 10,000 calcium ions is enough to generate a neural signal by interacting with neurons. And this process of the retinol opening, it's a very cool, complicated quantum process in which quantum coherence is, it goes through multiple intermediate stages that this energy goes into reconfiguring it, and it's very coherent. In fact, most photochemistry, just because you take a single quantum and you're dumping a single quantum of energy into a molecule by a quantum mechanical effect. Those processes you typically need, to figure out what's happening quantum mechanically to understand them.
Okay, if there are no more questions, let's thank our speaker for this very enlightening talk.
Thank you. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Shibdas. And I'm very happy to talk with you. And thank you guys all for the really excellent questions. I would even say discussion, for the excellent discussion.
Very interesting talk.
Yes.
Okay. Bye.
Bye. Bye.